broke almost every world record for batting. Yet he bowled well enough to dismiss Don Bradman 3 times in Test matches. He was England's greatest batsman, yet his finest Test innings yielded just 32 runs. He was moody and sensitive, yet supremely confident. A giant of the game, Walter Hammond is one of ESPN's legends of cricket. Melbourne, 1937. England were trapped on a deadly, unplayable sticky pitch. As 13 wickets fell for under 100 runs, Walter Hammond made his stand.
England were caught on a very wet wicket, and Hammond played what in my view was his greatest innings. It was on a diabolical sticky wicket against O'Reilly, who knew how to bowl on a sticky wicket and by all accounts bowled well. And there are stories in the press, you can look in the press reports of balls pitching and then just flying over the wicketkeeper's head. It was a lethal wicket. But Hammond, whereas everyone else was struggling, Hammond was fine.
Though Hammond made just 32 runs, this was considered to be the greatest innings played by one of cricket's greatest batsmen. Hammond was a daring and brilliant batsman, especially early in his career. When he went back, he kept his head still and over the ball. And on the front foot, he had perhaps the finest cover drive of all time.
Hammond, to me, when I was a boy growing up, I was a left-hander, but Mum had a big old wardrobe at home with a big mirror, and I used to put the photograph of Walter Hammond playing this cover drive on the front of Cricket Crisis, the Jack Middleton book. And I used to stand in front of that and practice it for hours, just practicing, going through and looking at the mirror, and was I playing it the same as what this shot of Walter Hammond. So the influence of Hammond on me was enormous.
He was a great player, one of the greatest players England's ever produced. Against O'Reilly and the others, they just thought he was a really great player, particularly strong on the offside. Probably not as good on the leg stump, but he certainly scored a lot of runs against Australia, against great bowling, such as O'Reilly and the others, and Grimmett and so.
More than anybody else, he seems to get himself into position, and you can see that he's going to get all his weight into the shot. He's very correct and a very elegant batsman. But the outstanding thing to me about watching him on film is that you can see he's in position where he's going to be able to apply maximum leverage on the ball, really get his weight into it and hit it hard without any apparent effort. He was an effortless. He looked as if he did it easily, but that was because he was always in perfect position.
Hammond was also a medium-fast bowler, good enough to take 83 Test wickets.
He was a very good medium-pace bowler. In fact, he could bowl quite quick, but he protected himself to make his career longer by not putting stress, by putting too many overs in. But he could have opened the bowling with England and bowled as quick as most bowlers.
Well, Hammond was a medium-pace bowler. Bradman told me that he regarded him as nearly as good a bowler as Maurice Tate. And Bradman said that Hammond was a very, very great cricketer, and his bowling, because his batting was so good, his bowling was probably underrated, but he did make the point that when Hammond didn't do well with the bat, he always managed to do quite well with the ball.
Hammond was swift and sure in the field, and in the slips, the greatest of his time.
One of the things that they used to say was that he was such a fantastic slip catcher, and something had happened, where's the ball gone? I couldn't see it. It was in his pocket. I mean, he's just so quick.
At the time, Walter Hammond, when he played, topped 100 Test catches, which was a remarkable achievement given that in his era, Test cricket wasn't played to the same extent as it is in the modern game. So Hammond's catching record really gives you an indication of what a fine pair of hands he had. He was regarded universally as one of the best slip fielders in his era, and in fact the figures suggest he's one of the best slip fielders there's been in any era.
I got a feeling he might have taken 100 Test catches, and he took 80 odd wickets as well, so he was obviously you only hear him spoken about as a batsman, but obviously he was a pretty decent all-round cricketer.
Walter Hammond's first-class career got off to a false start. Born in Dover, Kent, he had to serve a 2-year residential qualification in order to play for Gloucestershire.
Well, basically, he was born in the wrong county, which is the big problem in those days. County cricket was such a powerhouse, and he wanted to play for Gloucestershire. He was born in Kent, and Lord Harris, who was the Obergruppenführer of English cricket at the time, he was a Kent man, and basically said, no, you're playing for us or no one. And so it took forever to get his registration through. He eventually got round to playing for Gloucestershire, but it took a couple of years off his career, which frankly he should have had. He was good enough all along.
By 1925, Hammond had made 6 centuries, the last of which earned him an invitation to tour the West Indies with an MCC team. Hammond topped the batting averages and finished second on the bowling averages on the Caribbean tour, but illness forced him to miss the entire 1926 season.
First got picked for England, then went to the West Indies with the England side in 25-26, which was his first tour, and went there as the next big thing at a time when England were looking for quality Test cricketers. But in the West Indies, he scored a lot of runs, but there was no Test matches played. But then fell ill, and there was a lot of speculation about what actually occurred as to what his illness was.
Hammond returned in 1927, an even better batsman. He made almost 3,000 runs with 12 centuries.
Hammond was ill in 1926, and when he came back into the game, he really was, if you like, hardened and desiring to make the most of every opportunity that came his way.
He was a man with a great appetite for batting. He had a slow start to his career because he wasn't allowed to play for one season because he had to qualify to play for Gloucestershire. Lord Harris saw that he was blocked for a season because he didn't approve of not playing for the county of your birth. But he scored more than 10 centuries in 5 different seasons, and that's pretty prolific.
Walter Hammond failed in the first test of the 1928-29 series against Australia. It was then that he did what Stephen Waugh would do 60 years later. He changed the way he batted.
Around the time of his Test debut in 1927, and it sort of culminated when he got to Australia in 28-9, he, I think, had a look at cricket and decided the idea of batting was to score as many runs as you could. And as part of that, his attitude was that he wasn't going to play shots that were going to get him out. And he, like, as Steve Waugh's done in the current era, and as Bob Simpson did when he was at the start of his career, he decided the hook shot wasn't worth playing.
Whilst the cover drive was the shot that Walter Hammond is always famous for, the hook shot is not one that he is associated with, and it's one he basically cut out of his repertoire as a high-risk shot, a low percentage shot, if you like. So as a result of that, you wouldn't see the dashing hook shots and pull shots that you might have seen from the likes of Bradman in that period. But nevertheless, he was a really outstanding run getter, as he showed on the 1928-29 tour of Australia.
He scored 200 in the second test and another double century in the third test, then hundreds in each innings of the fourth test. I mean, in the middle 3 tests of that series just never looked like getting out. The only time he failed to get to 100 was when he got run out in the second innings in Sydney in the second test. It was just an astonishing orgy almost of run getting. It was unprecedented. He was the first player to score 900 runs in a series, and it was the way he got them, and just constantly hitting through the cover field.
And the 28-9 series in Australia was dominated by Hammond. I think one of the significant things about that series is that one of the people watching him throughout that series was Don Bradman. And I think his performance on that series must have been one of the things that influenced Bradman in his remorseless... the fact that Australia were pretty well crushed, I'm sure increased Bradman's resolve and desire to win at all costs against England.
He finished with 905 runs, averaging more than 113. By tour's end, he was recognised as the world's greatest batsman.
Hammond might be the greatest offside player that ever lived, and by all accounts hit the ball as hard as anyone. And the reason for that was that he was a beautifully balanced player, and a player who in his prime, if the ball was, his weight would just go through the shot, and he'd just propel the ball through the offside, whether off the front or the back foot. And he was just one of those batsmen who had a classic stance, and then he's just the weight would go forward or back, and so he always hit the ball full face of the bat, and technically was excellent, and he stood tall, used his height, was a well-built bloke, but the general consensus was he hit the ball as hard as anyone.
By the end of the 1930 summer, a new force had overtaken even the great Hammond, a phenomenon named Bradman. Every great innings he played over the next decade seemed to be met with an even greater one by the Don.
It was one of those situations where almost everything Hammond did, Bradman did better. Hammond scored 905 runs in the 28-9 series in Australia. Bradman came out in 1930 and scored 974 runs. In 1936-37, Hammond scored this magnificent double century in the second test to put England 2 up in the series. Bradman scored 270, 212 and 169 in the last 3 tests, and Australia won 3-2. And Hammond scored a hell of a lot of runs, but despite that fact that the sort of runs he was scoring was almost unprecedented, that was before Bradman came along.
Bradman and Hammond were pitted against each other on many occasions. I don't think there was any enmity between them. They would have been jealous of each other's careers, but I think there was a mutual respect between them.
There's probably 2 guys that suffered most in reputation because of Bradman, because both Wally Hammond and Bill Ponsford they made huge scores. 200s were just like everybody else getting a 50. And I think if Bradman hadn't come along, probably Hammond and Ponsford both would have had a far greater reputation. Their reputation was probably pretty great at the time when they played, but I think they would have had a greater reputation for longer if Bradman hadn't come along and just wiped out all batting records.
Hammond did surpass Bradman in one innings in 1933. He made 336 not out against New Zealand, breaking the Don's world record of 334.
Walter Hammond's 336 not out is a very interesting score in itself, if only for the fact that the myth has developed that he scored that number of runs purely and simply to get past Don Bradman's 334, which had been the previous test record. That really was another example of the myth that built up of the rivalry between Bradman and Hammond. The fact that Hammond was so determined to get past Bradman's mark and did so, and as soon as he got past it, the declaration came.
Here's a historic stroke that does it.
Hammond had become the England captain by the time Hutton made his 364 in 1938. Even then, Bradman seemed to loom large in Hammond's thinking.
I think off the field, Hammond and Bradman were okay as far as relationship goes, but on the field they both played it very, very hard. And there's the famous test at the Oval when Hutton got 364, and Hammond was relentless, had to go on and go on and go on, and basically because he realised that no matter how many runs he got, there was always that possibility that Bradman would come out and get even more. And it wasn't until Bradman fell over bowling and damaged his ankle and wasn't going to bat that Hammond declared.
As a Test and county captain, Hammond was not universally admired. Off the field, he was aloof and moody.
It is fair enough to say that he was not a popular man. His personality was, they say, changed after that 1926 tour of the Caribbean, where he contracted a rather unpleasant disease, and the mercury treatment had an effect upon his personality.
He'd got a dark side, and he wasn't over popular in county cricket, and maybe even at England level. And when I say the dark side, he had terrifically high standards of his own performance and was pretty intolerant of people who didn't match up to them at county level, and most people didn't, because he's one of the all-time greats.
At Lord's in 1938, Hammond played one of his most regal and authoritative innings, making 240 after England had been in trouble at 3 for 31. Walter Hammond served in the Royal Air Force during World War II, then returned to play in the victory tests against the Australians in 1945.
Hammond was, by 1938, he was clearly the best cricketer in England. He was the number one batsman. So that when, after the war, it was natural that if Hammond wanted to, that he would be the England captain. And the victory tests were actually a magnificent series of cricket. Keith Miller was making his appearance for Australia, and he was the star of the Australian team. But the whole cricket was played in an atmosphere of great, joy. And Hammond certainly joined into that. And he batted very well, scored a lot of runs, and batted in his old carefree style.
The England team that Hammond took to Australia in late 1946 was a mediocre one. Lindwall and Miller ran riot. Hammond had a poor series, and England were crushed.
The 46-7 series was a personal disaster for Hammond. The tour, in hindsight, I'm sure he wishes he'd never gone on the tour. That he was to English cricket what Bradman was to Australian cricket. In the same way, it was very important that Bradman came back to play for Australia after the war. It was important that Hammond came back for England.
He has been criticised for his performance in Australia in 46-7, but in talking to Bradman defended him very strongly then, said that he felt he probably hadn't wanted to come to Australia in 46-7, he was getting old, but that he did it for cricket, and he felt that it was unfortunate that he was criticised because he didn't do well in that tour, because he felt he'd done the right thing by the game, and he didn't play well himself, but he'd made a sacrifice to come out here, and it just hadn't worked for him.
Hammond did play one outstanding innings in 46-47 in Brisbane. It was a repeat of his effort on the Melbourne glue pot a decade earlier, and the last glimpse of his greatness.
In that test, when he was caught in the wet wicket against two really great bowlers, and Hammond was, must have been approaching 40 then, it was an extraordinary effort against people of the calibre, young men of the calibre of Lindwall and Miller, to be able to play such an innings.
Hammond retired from Test cricket after the 1946-47 tour and left England abruptly for South Africa.
There was a sad side to him and a sad end to his life, because he emigrated from England into South Africa, and in 1964-5 MJK, my former county captain MJK Smith, led England to South Africa under the managership of Donald Carr, and broadcasting BBC was Brian Johnston. And in Durban, where Wally lived, Brian spotted him standing in a very lonely and detached way at the back of a net, and went up to him and said, "You wouldn't remember me, Mr. Hammond, back in 1948 I did a radio interview with you in London when Brian was just starting." And Wally said, "Well, I do, yes." He said, "What about this England side?" And for 10 minutes they had a very animated conversation about who could play: Barrington, Boycott, Dexter, Smith, all these. And he said, "Well, have you spoken to the players on this tour?" He said, "No, I don't like to." He said, "I don't want to push myself. This is one of the all-time greats." And Brian Johnston said, "Well, if I can arrange it, would you like to go into the dressing room?" And Wally said yes, and he went to Donald Carr, Brian, and arranged it, and he went in, and for half an hour people like Ken Barrington and like MJK and Fred Titmuss and David Allen, they sat in absolute awe as this god from the past just talked to them at a level that they understood, and they worshipped him so much. He was in failing health then. He'd had a car accident. They didn't know he was going to die within months, but they all clubbed together to pay for an airfare to fly him into the Port Elizabeth for the final test match, and that was a mark of the esteem and admiration that people of another generation had about the great man.
Hammond never fully recovered from the accident. He died in 1965, aged 62. He left an indelible mark on the record books. Some of those records survive to this day. His 336 not out in Auckland remains the fastest triple century of all. Walter Hammond played in 85 test matches. He made 7,249 runs at an average of 58.45. He made 22 test centuries. He took 83 wickets and 110 catches. In all first-class cricket, he made 50,551 runs at an average of 56.1, with 167 centuries. He took 732 wickets at 30.58. But Walter Hammond transcends his statistics. His ability on difficult wickets and his devastating cover drive were masterful. In another era, he would have been the greatest.
I saw Hammond, Walter Hammond bat as a schoolboy. I saw him play a couple of times, I think, and I thought on all pitches, I would say on all pitches, bat pitches, he's the greatest that's ever lived.
He was a showman. He was a stroke player. He enjoyed being a spectacle as a batsman, and he was a more interesting player to watch than Don Bradman, who he never hit the ball in the air. He was a machine, an accumulator. In modern parlance, it's almost like not quite, but almost like the differences between Sachin Tendulkar and Brian Lara. Sachin Tendulkar is the man who you would rely on to score runs when it mattered, but Brian Lara, he would get the spectacular scores that would stand out really for posterity.
Wally Hammond probably is undersung these days. If you can read what was written about him during the 1930s, if that reputation that he worked so hard to build had been sustained, I think he would be tripping off the lips. But you don't hear much about Hammond, and that is a tragedy, because he may well have been the greatest, in using the word very carefully, the greatest cricketer that England have ever produced.
If Bradman surpassed him, no other batsman did, and no other batsman demonstrated such a command of bad wickets. Walter Hammond made the difficult business of batting look easy. He was one of the master batsmen and is welcomed into the ranks of ESPN's Legends of Cricket.